the political commentator with Young Voices UK, Alex Petropoulos, joins us now to go through the papers. Alex, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
How much of a problem do you think the Prime Minister has within his own party and MPs on his quite caveated statement that he gave over the weekend?
You know, there'll always be some MPs within his party which will take issue with this, but I think really the attention should be on those MPs for, to be honest, drawing a quite bizarre comparison, saying Trump is just like Putin, saying that, this is a double standard for not criticizing Trump in the same way that you criticize Putin. But I think that this is just completely ridiculous. Nicolas Maduro was a dictator who oppressed his people. And while there are lots of very important questions about, this democratic transition of power, the question about removing him in a manner which seems to have, been completely minimal damage to the rest of the country, minimal collateral damage.
It's about what he's done, though, rather than necessarily how.
Yeah, it's about this question of international rules-based order. But to be honest, if you ask me, I think that a lot of the time we talk about this international rules-based order, but in practice, it doesn't really exist. Vladimir Putin doesn't care about international rules-based order. The reason China isn't invading Taiwan isn't because it cares about international rules-based order. It's because of hard power. And so actually seeing the Prime Minister move away from his usual stance, which is that international law is supreme and we must respect it, when in practice, that's not how I view the way the world works, and especially the way these authoritarian regimes look at the world. And you can't take one side of the fence and expect them to take the same side of the fence as you. If they respect hard power, you have to have the hard power for them to respect.
But the person demonstrating the hard power right now is Donald Trump, acting as an authoritarian regime, saying, OK, well, I don't like the leadership of this country, so I'll take over.
Yes, and it's the takeover part which is the problem there, not necessarily the remove murderous and oppressive dictator part, right? So I think that we should be able to separate those two things out. And I think a blanket removing Maduro because of, quote, international law is, to be honest, a weak intellectual response, at least defaulting to it and just saying this is obviously bad and there's no way, no scenario under which this would be good because, quote, international law, is just refusing to look at like the broader context of this was clearly a very bad hombre, to use Trump language, who was causing massive harm to his own people. And removing him will probably be not good. However, you should really have a plan for what happens after that.
Well,
and so
what happens after?
What is this plan? Where is the democratic transition of power? Those are the really big questions.
And we don't have the answers to that. What we do have,
exactly.
Andrew Neil has written in the Mail today saying Emperor Trump's ambitions should terrify Greenland. And we've just looked at the front page of the Daily Telegraph, but to quote the president again, we do need Greenland, absolutely. He said it was officials in the administration who would decide what happened to Greenland, not Denmark.
Yeah, and the view, at least as far as I understand it, is that they want Greenland because it sits in a very important strategic location for submarines coming from Russia. Look, this might just be Trump sort of playing the game he's played a few times where he provokes Europe into developing more of this hard power itself. He sort of calls out a bluff and says, Europe, you need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. You need to be able to stand up to counter Russia. I'd like to see you doing more of that. Now, it could also him just be completely questioning the territorial sovereignty of Greenland, which would be a completely different situation to Venezuela. I don't think that Denmark or Greenland are run by authoritarian dictatorships, and taking over Greenland would be a clear escalation and difference for me, at the very least. I'd say there'd be different circumstances, right?
Well, yeah, materially different. But the fact that we're even talking about it as a possibility, that's a problem, isn't it?
It is, and yet Trump has talked about this before. I guess the problem is that people have now internalized that this is an option on the table. I don't necessarily think that all of this being said, that it is a complete option on the table. Like we said, it's a materially different circumstance. He said before, oh, I'm going to take over Canada and make it a 51st state. I'm going to take over Greenland. In practice, I don't think there's a small amount of credence you lay to that, but in practice, these are more rhetoric and more of signals to other leaders to do things that he'd like them to do, rather than an outright threat that he will commit to.
We'll have more on this later on in the programme. But for now, let's move on to some other stories. And, well, it's sort of slightly linked. We talked about the Prime Minister's comments. Keir Starmer setting out a plan to save his premiership. It was very bad timing because he planned this very big sit-down television interview over the weekend. He wrote a piece in the Sunday Times. And of course, that all happened, scheduled to be released just after Donald Trump's actions in Venezuela. So he's had to kind of try to carefully draw a line between saying he upholds international law but not upsetting Donald Trump, which has upset some of his own MPs, as we've talked about. But the main thing he's tried to say is, look, to anyone who's trying to take me on, this is front page of the Times, ousting me would be a gift for Nigel Farage. Do you think the Prime Minister's right?
He might be right, but I think it's the wrong line to be taking. I think it's not a line that wins you an election. I think that the British people voted for change. That was Labour's big message. And saying, oh, if you don't stick with me, you get change, isn't really a winning message when the British public are upset because they're not seeing the change that is happening. I think he needs to focus on delivering that change, focus on pushing for the reforms that would actually turn the country around, rather than this negative framing, this fear framing around Farage.
The challenge for the Prime Minister is obviously got to get through the May elections. How likely do you think it actually is that there'll be a leadership challenge after then, or even before?
I think absent of Starmer laying out a plan and having confidence in that plan, I'd say that I could see a leadership challenge, maybe like 40% likelihood after the elections, after the local elections. But he has this massive majority. Even a challenge wouldn't necessarily win. He has this incredible mandate to enact massive change. And so I guess what myself and the rest of the country are frustrated by is his sense of urgency and his sense of ability to do things. And it really does feel like he's operating on a really tiny majority in comparison to the actual ability he has to create sweeping change across the country if he wanted to. Yeah, it's fascinating to see how he's trying to sort of re-control the narrative, and there'll be lots of pressure on him, I'm sure, today as Parliament comes back, and we'll look forward to Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. I'm sure his statement on Venezuela will come to quite significant scrutiny as well. Can we just move on to something away from politics and international diplomacy for a moment or two? There's an interesting piece by Mark Selman, the technology correspondent, who the headline is here: tracking devices make children more anxious and less independent. Health experts warn that having sort of a surveillance childhood, so parents having you on Find My Friends or whatever, prevents younger people learning skills, developing sort of the autonomy they need. We're obviously too old for this, but how would you have felt if your parents sort of tracking you as a teenager? I would have felt quite uncomfortable. And, I have a younger brother. It's about 5 years younger than me. And my parents do this with him. They have this little tracking app. And for me, this is just like completely bonkers. And I would have felt super uncomfortable with this whole situation. And I think I do agree with the results as they seem to be, which is that you lose your independence. You lose your ability to learn and make mistakes and take risks. And I think that in general, young people today are being discouraged from taking risks and from trying things and learning things across the board. And they need to be encouraged to do this more and to, live and experience the world. Yeah, I had a dinner with my sister over the weekend, and she said, because I went for a walk in Hampton Court with some friends, and she said, I saw you were in Hampton Court. And I thought, that's weird. How do you know? And she said, I've got you on Find My Friends. And I had actually forgotten that was there. I mean, would you use it with anyone to sort of say, I'm okay for someone to know exactly where I am at all times when I'm with my phone? I do actually. I have a number of my friends. My rule is all of my friends who live in other countries, I have on it. And then it's very fun. And then you get to go on and you can go on your maps. And sometimes you see, so-and-so's in this country, so-and-so's in that country. And so it is a nice thing to have for your friends to sort of be able to see, they're in this country, they're doing this. And it can spark conversations and whatnot. But people who live nearby me, I wouldn't want them to have that level of knowledge about where I am. Okay. What I'm doing. Makes sense. Alex, thank you very much for your time. Alex Petropoulos going through the papers with us today.